Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. In fact, I think we're standing room only already, which is really kind of remarkable for Saturday morning. My name is Jeff Rosenheim. I am a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, and it's a great pleasure to be able to moderate this discussion with these artists this morning. And I'll be seeing you again this afternoon at the second panel. Matt Brogan is going to do the third panel even later in the afternoon. First thing I've been asked is to say if you're not hearing this well and you're listening to the presentation on the earphones, press the blue button. I'm getting a yes. You're all hearing me. Who is not? Okay, we got through that. Second thing is that at the end of each of the panels, there will be a book signing, and the book signing is downstairs in what's known as the lecture room, which I believe is near the cafe. And the book signing will take place for books that have been published by the individual artists, as well as this beautiful catalog, which if you haven't had a chance to see it, you'll have a chance to see. I believe they're available downstairs. I'm hoping that all of my catalogs will be signed by the artists. And maybe you would like to have the same. A couple of things. Those of you who have had a chance to see the exhibition downstairs all of us realize that it's a complex and dense show filled with pictures, heartfeltly made pictures by the 12 artists on this project. And they're demanding, as they should be. They will repay your attention the more energy and input you put into them. Each of these artists have something to say. The questions that they ask: what's the role of the camera in our society? Why is this tool useful today? What purpose does the camera have? Each of them had to answer that question personally. Those are questions that are deep, especially when you go to a place with as much potent and complexity as Israel, and in the truth that each artist brings forth, the questions of identity, the identity of the artist, the identity of this place that has been called many things for so long: Palestine, the Holy Land, Israel. The exhibition title obviously is carefully orchestrated to avoid naming it in any one way or another, but I hope that in our discussions today we'll be able to ask the artists questions about what they learned about this place, what it means to them, and why they did it, why they participated, and what they chose to do with their time there. Time is precious. Our time today is precious. I hope that after the discussion, we'll have some questions from you. We had a press preview and there were only a few. We're hoping that the press is more shy than this crowd. I count on you to challenge us. And I count on my fellow panelists to challenge each other and to challenge you. So in discussions with some of the artists, I think we can say one thing, which is that photography plays an interesting role. It's an art form. It can be a tool of propaganda. It's a device, the camera is a device that is about seeing. Some of us believe that seeing is a creative act. But there's a political side to seeing, which is revealing. The pointing that is key to photography is about pointing something and avoiding something. And I think that the best of these questions, the most complex questions, are asked by the artists on this panel. So to lead us off, that's the preamble. To lead us off, maybe we'll start with Fazl, who is to my right. I guess the names are very clear. He made an exhibition he made a project based on many things, but on looking at what is hidden, what you can't see always so clearly when you're actually on the ground, but miraculously or specially and beautifully and provocatively, you can see it from a different perspective. That's what photography is. in its essence. Fausto?
Thanks, Jeff. The piece that I contributed, Desert Bloom, to the exhibition is actually one of 3 pieces that I worked on in Israel, entitled the Erasure Trilogy. And my working process is such that I prefer to go to a place with a very open perspective. Israel was an extraordinarily confounding and intimidating place for me to accept an invitation to work in. And it took me 2 or 3 trips to find the thing that sort of suited my temperament and also was, in a way, consistent with the trajectory of my own work in the past. By extension, I should say that this is the second of the three projects. It develops and moves on forward from a piece that I made called Memory Trace, which was about the evacuated villages that the Palestinians had left in 1948. And in a way, the starting point for this piece, however, was an encounter one day I had in the southern Negev. I went to one of what had been an unrecognized village of Al-Araqib in the south one afternoon, and sitting there in a makeshift protest tent. This was a tent that was erected upon the land that had only a few weeks prior been a village. And I had not had the opportunity to see the village as it was, as it existed with the people living there. And sitting there in this protest tent, I was looking out across the desert, and already not only had the homes been razed to the ground and the land plowed under, but they were beginning, the JNF was beginning the preparations of the troughs for what would be the planting of the ambassador forest. The ambassador forest is a forest, a green belt that is to surround Beersheba. And sitting there, I had never before been interested in aerial photography in particular, but I had the sense of not understanding what exactly it was I was looking at. And I thought perhaps the only way to begin to understand that would be to fly above the land and to see the space of what was the village within a broader context. As I soon learned when I began these flights, it was a kind of developed into an interrogation of what Ben-Gurion's invocation to make the desert bloom meant. I wanted to see, be receptive to the way in which the Negev, the desert, has been transformed in the years since the start of the state of Israel. And so for me, it's very much about a kind of initial openness to receive some sort of prompting, some sort of clue, not only that links to the trajectory of your own work, but for me also emotionally something that would be substantive and about what I saw as the essential contemporary current issues of the country. So this piece delves into all facets. It's about the landscape as being transformed into forest. It's about industrialization. It's about the loss of land or the transformation of land. And it's about different kinds of approaches to how we engage, what our stewardship is with the land. The Bedouin, my final comment would be that the Bedouin, I realized when flying above, had somehow over centuries learned a means by which to function in a very forbidding terrain, but with a kind of fragile harmony. And here I was witnessing something that was more about a sort of a willful transformation of what that terrain had once been. And so I wanted, in a way, to mark this time along a continuum in which, if I return in 10, 20 years, what I'll see in that site where I sat that day would be a mature forest. And that was something for me that was emotionally poignant.
And I believe you also took the time to listen to stories to fill out that part of it. You want to talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of my process. In fact, when I first went for the exploratory mission and beyond, I thought, I'm fairly well read about the country, but it was my first trip to Israel, and I was interested then to hear from combatants on both sides of the divide what the time of, well, leading up to and involving 48 meant to them. So I spoke to people, Arab and Jewish people, who had lived side by side, and then would tell me about what this rupture, what this fissure had meant for both communities. It was something for me that very interesting, that all of us as artists have had the opportunity to move with great fluidity between one community and another, which is something I think is rather unique, certainly for people who are living in the region.
Sure. Thank you. Joseph, whose project is less about what is invisible, but then about something that you cannot imagine what its visual presence is in the land, and until you see it for yourself. Tell us about the wall.
When I was approached by
Push. Good.
When I was approached by Frederick Brenner, who I know probably nearly for 30 years or 25 years, to participate on the project and in Israel, my reaction immediately was no, I don't want. It's very difficult to resist Frederick. Yeah. Finally, he convinced me. He said, Joseph, you never went there. Once you have to go to Israel, and at least you should go to see. So he proposed me that I'm going to be invited for 10 days on the tourist trip, that they will take me around Israel, and I have full right to refuse. I'm very sensitive on these proposals. So I said, okay, I will go, but there is going to be a condition. I'm going to pay my ticket, because I want to feel that I don't have any obligation to you, which I did. So I went around Israel, and I look at everything. I consider myself as this little man who last 40 years was walking on this earth, looking around with the camera, and from time to time, when he saw something interesting, something what has to do with him, he pressed the button. It happened that during this trip, I saw the wall. I was born 1938, before the war. I lived through German occupation in a little village. It was very hard. I lived through Russian occupation. First of all, before Russian occupation, I saw the Russians liberating us, and then I saw coming them and occupying us. And luckily enough, I'm still here, and I saw that finally they went away. So I have certain opinion about quite a few things, which my Italian friends say, Giuseppe, che culo tu hai. You saw everything what I haven't seen. You went through everything what I was not able to live through. So when I saw the wall, of course, I grew up, like most of you, from my generation, behind the Iron Curtain. And all my life, I wanted to go on the other side. And all my life, I hear how these German revanchists are trying to destroy the Czechoslovakian Republic, and how bad it was that French signed the peace with them. So I saw this little piece of the wall, and I was really fascinated by that. Yeah. I was fascinated, first of all, because my experience, and then because I'm not a religion person, but in my head, there existed Palestine. There existed Jesus Christ. There existed this Holy Land. And suddenly I saw what's happening to this Holy Land. So, last nearly 25 years, I photograph how contemporary men influence the landscape. Maybe some of you, 20 years ago, 1994, saw on the Prague Castle my exhibition, which was called Black Triangle. It was the first thing which I did when I returned to Czechoslovakia. I saw this devastated land which used to be called Garden of the Bohemia, how it was devastated. Gradually, I made 10 books since that on the how contemporary men influenced the landscape. So when I saw the wall, I said, Josef, maybe you can do something here. So I asked Frederick for other trip, because I was not sure if what I saw, it is really representative or not. So finally, I got another trip, and after 4 times coming to Israel, when I was sure that I can't be manipulated, that I'm going to have the freedom to do what I want to do and control what I want to do, I signed the contract when I said, I'm going to do something similar what I did in Czechoslovakia 20 years ago, that this is going to be book, similar artist book, Black Triangle, and because this project was 12 photographers, and it's very difficult to participate in a control project of more photographers, I said, and this book must be in all length to open on the collective exhibition. That's what I did.
And you're among the more generous, well, all of the artists were unbelievably generous to me personally, but I've been working for some 26 years at the Metropolitan Museum, and in all that time I'd never actually gone out into the world with an artist making pictures. And one day you were kind enough to invite me to the place where you were working, and it wasn't just enough for him to invite me, that was extraordinary. Not every artist wants to have a curator behind them looking over their shoulder, but this artist, and I thank you, actually grabbed me by the collar and made me look through his camera. And I can't forget, I will never forget that. I'm not sure I saw what you saw, but I'd never actually been allowed in that way. And so this is just a thank you. Thank you, Joseph. It was extraordinary for me, and it helped. It does help. Continues to help. Gilles. Gilles has a project downstairs and an ongoing project. He's photographed in the same community for how many years? Push the button. 20?
Well, it's not a continuous 20 years. I started to work in Hebron around the time of Oslo, so that's about, 96, something like that. I had not worked in Silwan before.
But you'd been there, no?
Yeah, I drove through Silwan, but, I didn't work in Silwan before.
So Gilles' projects have been around the world. He has not avoided the hot spots, the tensions that define our time today. And he uses the camera in a particular way. The pictures have as he says, they're very clear. It's hard to understand exactly what that means at times. But he photographed over the project time more or less in one community.
Yeah.
And looks at it from different perspectives. I think the interesting thing for me about what Gilles has done, and maybe he'll tell us about it, is the way in which the questions are asked and what the solutions are about what the camera can do, what it should do, and what we ask of it and what we take away from it. So this issue of intentionality comes clear, very clear in your work. So what were you trying to do?
I'm not going to answer that question. The question as to what my intent was, what the piece is about, and so on, is not for me to comment on. It's for you or critics and so on. All I can do, and there is a very special reason, or very focused reason as to why I do not comment on the piece, on the work, or on the intention. And we'll get back to that, if you want to. Now, as to the general circumstance around my work here or my work in general, it's pretty coherent and self-evident. I mean, you mentioned before, I've worked in the region before, and I've worked in similar circumstances, which is I worked in Hebron on 2 square kilometers around the Machpelah, around the grave of the patriarch. And over the years, it's something that I've done in many projects. And so it's very much about mapping, it's very much about anthropology, and it's very much about a battle for territory. So there's a great picture by Stephen Shaw downstairs from Hebron, where he shoots Hebron and the divide between the two worlds from above. You really have to understand that what happens down there is on a meter per meter basis, room to room, which is there is a battle for space in that square kilometer, which is literally room to room. And of course, it's a tragic battle. But as you go back over the years, you see the subtle changes in the landscape. You see the Arab market disappearing, and you see the stores disappearing one by one, and so on. And I work with deep attention, and I go back to the same street corners over and over again. Now, most of the projects I've done are about similar issues, whether it's in the Balkans, in Northern Ireland, and so on. All the projects I've done are about that mystery as to why people see each other or construct each other as different. And the rituals and the processes by which they do so, and how it manifests itself in lives, in existences, in wasted lives. So, for me to work in, I cannot call it Israel, it's Israel-Stein for me. It's really a combination of the two entities, is perfectly natural. It's part of my destiny. I would have done it with or without this project. Now, in as much as I don't want to give you an interpretation of the piece or my intent, I'm happy later to engage in discussion with you and with my colleagues as to the more profound or theoretical aspects of what we do, which are, fundamental questions as to what is the photographic process, what is the relationship between the photographic and the political, and how do we approach issues of democracy, meaning, ambiguity, and so on. We'll get back to that, I'm sure.
I certainly hope so. I like this idea that you go to the same street corner and over a period of time watch it. I mean, the medium of photography, for the most part, you can't photograph the past. You can photograph traces of it. You can't really photograph, and I think Fazl has figured out a way, weirdly, to do so, but you really can't photograph the future. But you can photograph the present, and all too often we're too impatient to actually return to the current present enough times to see those patterns. And I think all of these artists have done that, and Gilles, I think your work is exceptional for doing that, whether it's in Northern Ireland or in Silwan. Wendy. Wendy's project is very interesting because not only is she seeing in her work the opportunity to explore how cameras are used by citizenry, whether they're adults or younger adults, kids, but also she gets to ask the questions, again, those questions about role. What is the role of the camera? But she gets to ask questions that are very interesting because she gives away the tools these artists use. Or she allows those picture makers, at whatever age they are, to show her what's important to them. And her installation is, I had no idea how she was going to install these pictures, and I must say the solutions are pretty extraordinary. When you see the pictures, you realize that each vessel is another community's own ideas of what's important to them. And that's what's important to Wendy. So.
Well, I think I'm really interested in finding a visual language within each of these places that I've worked. And I think the terrifying thing about working in a place like we did, whatever we call it, is that it does have this binary vision, and to me that's a very as an artist, a very uncreative way of looking at things. And but I really sort of despaired at how I could pick that apart. And I started off thinking about Ronit and I visited lots of different educational institutions. Because I was interested in seeing how education creates the country, and that led me to a school. Ronit led me to a school for Orthodox women, a military academy, a place I never would have thought about working. But at the same time, the place that I felt most comfortable and excited visually by was Nazareth. So I started off by working in those very different places, and was able to see very quickly that there was a very different visual language. Not only what they photographed, but how they photographed, how they used the cameras, and also how their environments were constructed. So out of something that I was terrified by failing to come to a visual language, it started to reveal itself quite easily. And then I added to that as time went on, and I worked with people went back and forth for quite a while, and made interviews and collected pieces of their lives. Not all of that is in the show, but will be in the book. And eventually, some people started seeing the collection of photographs that I had, and suggested places or came to me and said, will you work with this group or that group? And eventually I realized that I needed to say yes to those things, that the fact that these projects were coming to me was also another revelation of the place. And so I followed that until a point where I said, I guess that I'm mapping the country now in this way, and then added more consciously. The last group I worked with was a group of Christian kids in the 6th grade.
So to break out of the binary program, you found this multivalent, how many projects?
14.
You can't imagine how hard it must have been. The interesting thing about looking at, if you will, the voices, the images, and the experiences of your subjects' own pictures is the opportunity to see through someone else's eyes, to see in a collective way what a community feels or dreams about. I'm wondering if you began your presentations with the same method, or did each one require its own lead? How did you deal with that?
I started working really in the same way in the beginning, and then as I got to know people and got to know what was happening, it changed. But the idea in the beginning was to really get them to use the camera with as much control and consciousness as possible, and so the idea was that they had to learn to look hard at whatever it was that they were looking at, and it was quite fun, so there were different sort of exercises that we did together, whether the kids were in 6th grade or whether they were elderly women. And so it was lively, and sometimes there was conflict, but as the time went on, I started asking them to photograph things that were important in their lives, that I knew were important.
As in dreams?
Well, as in dreams, but also, for example, the elderly women in East Jerusalem that I worked with, they wanted to photograph in Sheikh Jarrah, they wanted to photograph the conflict with the settlers, but didn't know how to do it. And so I began talking to them about metaphor and ways that they could create photographs. But in fact, they began really photographing the marches and the conflict itself. And these were women in their 70s, and they never had a role before of being a picture maker. And so for some of them who particularly lived right next to settlers, it was a way of them fighting back and becoming stronger in their families and in their community.
Well, Gilles.
Yes.
I'm
still here.
Good. I think when we talked a little earlier today, we talked about the sort of paradox of photography as a sort of democratic and interesting tool, and the agenda that I think we all have as artists and as interpreters of pictures that we believe in, to find meaning or try to just to attack the central problems of our time. I think you've written in in the interview that you sort of see this place as a crux of something you're going to, I assume, going to continue to work with. How did you begin? I guess every day you were there. What you were looking at that street corner, if you will. Tell us a little bit about that process.
There's nothing special or glorious about the process. It's actually a very tedious process. Can you hear me or not?
Yeah, talk. Yeah, push.
So, there's nothing glorious or special about the process. It's actually a very tedious process. It's about the same streets, the same corners, the same families, the same people. You know, it's really about spending an inordinate amount of times, and so there's nothing great about it.
But something great comes from it.
If you say so. I don't, you know, honestly, okay. I'll try to be sincere. That's going to be difficult. I'm not comfortable with words, and I'm not comfortable with words because I've had to endure them too much when I was young. You know, when I went to school in the late 60s in France, you know, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of words, and so on. And I started to see an enormous gap between language and reality. A gap that was obscene and dangerous. So I decided to do away with words, willfully, voluntarily, and for a purpose. So photography at that time seemed fairly uncoded. And the interesting thing for me at that time, and still now, about photography is that it kind of happens between the moment of perception and the moment where you can define with a word, this is this is that. I'm interested in that space, because that space is a space where other ideas can emerge and pure ideas. And in that space, photography does something that's absolutely unique. It answers questions you never thought you could ask. So this is why you're going to find me reluctant to define what I do, how I do it, or what is the method. The method is about silence and presence, period. It's about looking, and it's about, you know, being respectful in a certain way. Now, once I've said that, there are other issues concerning photography that are absolutely fascinating. Beyond this notion that it can answer all the questions that you never thought you could ask, the question is, how does it answer those questions at best? And I think it's a very important question, you know, issue in relationship to that place. As you know, that place is highly charged, highly political, extremely ideological. And of course, there's an extreme danger for photography in that kind of environment. Because for photography to answer all those questions you never thought about asking, it has to follow an open text strategy, a strategy that doesn't try to control or define the meaning of things too much. So there are literally two kinds of photography. There's the photography produced by the magazines and by propaganda, where the picture is supposed to have one meaning and one meaning only. And when you look literally at the construct of the image, there's like an egg of meaning in the middle that defines what the picture is about. This is this, this is that. If that's not enough, you will generally have a caption or a title and so on. And that photography is a great temptation in highly charged environments like this one. But this is not what photography can give us. Photography, at its best, to answer all those questions, has to be an open text versus the closed text of the magazine language. It has to be equivocal when the magazine picture is univocal. And in that moment of ambiguity of the equivocal, you open a space for the reader to appropriate the image, to spend time, and to eventually surrender to the image. So this is the beginning of a process of democracy that Wendy understands better than anybody else, better than any of us, because what Wendy works on is democracy, in which in the end there is a multiplicity of authors in the image. Yes, the photographer, yes, the camera, reality that speaks with a vengeance, but also the reader. I think those issues become especially interesting to dissect within the context of that place as we're going to move on forward, because they are central to interpretation and polarization.
That's beautiful.
I think what is great, that we all are different. What Gilles, who is my closest friend in Magnum, what he talked about is not much my concern. I never worked for any magazine. I never work for anybody. I never work. Whatever I do just for myself. And I don't know if it is important, if it is not important, if it has any meaning, if it hasn't got any meaning, but it's important to do things which I think that I have to do. And I'm trying to do it. So I think if we want, and we don't want, we photograph the world. And because we photograph the world, we photograph the history of this world. 40 years ago, it happened that one day I came from Romania, where I photographed for one-man gypsies. Next day I woke up at 4 o'clock. Somebody called me and he said, Russians are here. I couldn't believe. I went on the street and I photographed the Russians. I never before photographed any event. I photographed the theater. I photographed the gypsies. I'm not particularly interested in violence. I'm not particularly interested in conflict. But it happened that I was part of something which really concerned me. So I didn't think about importance of the photography, what I'm going to do. It was without thinking, I picked up my cameras and I went on the streets and I started to photograph. I didn't photograph these, I didn't do these pictures for the magazine. They eventually were published all over the world 1 year after. 1 year after, in the politics and event of the world, it is something very old. In fact, I realized I photographed the news, but what was really already interesting, that 1 year after, still the world was interesting in to have a look on the news. What is even more interesting for me, that 40 years after, I published the book with 250 photographs, and this book was published without any support of the Czech government in 13 countries. And people who are buying it, I ask many times the question why they are buying it. I don't think that it was so important, this little country, which nobody knows much about. There are no news about Czech Republic in the world. I think the people are buying this book, and it happened that there are some countries where the book was published second time. So I put myself the question, why people are buying something what happened 40 years ago? The answer can be, for example, beside the book, there's the exhibition which is traveling around. I was very proud that about 3 years ago, I succeeded to do something what I never believed that I'd be able to do. I succeeded to bring a Russian tank back to Moscow. I've got an exhibition in Moscow. Definitely, today it won't be possible. The same exhibition should go to China. They told me there's no chance because it's 3 months already on the custom. The exhibition is not going to happen. Finally, but still they asked me to come there. I said, I'm not going to go there because there's no exhibition. I learned that finally they succeeded and the exhibition happened. But it just shows that it a little illustrates that this problem, which was in Czechoslovakia in that time, it is still a problem which exists everywhere. I think for me, any occupation is wrong in any country, and any time when some other people are taking freedom of some other people, there is something wrong. I think that's the reason that people are getting this book, and that this book was published in 13 countries. And I think I didn't want to make the book. When I did this book about the wall, you might notice that not on this show, but in the book which was published by Aperture and in 4 other countries, there is the text. You can imagine how we were very careful to stay on the line, to be as neutral as possible, because my aim was that this book is talking about something, even that it was done in Palestine and Israel. It's not talking only about Palestine and Israel, that it talks about something else, that it talks about the man and the land. And sometimes, in my pictures, you don't see the people. But sometimes, I think you can say something about the man very clearly, even if you don't see them being present.
That's something very much that's occupied me in this whole process. Back to Gilles' point about sort of intentionality and what we make when we make an image. Do we make it with the intention of a clear, closed frame wherein we expect a given response? For me, that's never been even remotely of interest. I find that it's more of interest to perhaps invite the viewer to experience the same kind of open-ended inquiry that we as artists experience. And I think perhaps, I hope that's what Gilles is saying, is that the work here is about a kind of an invitation to discussion rather than some sort of dogmatic message about something. For me, very profoundly, it was in the first instance very difficult to work in Israel, but once I touched upon these things that were somehow surprisingly taboo within the society to raise, the idea of the Nakba, of the idea that people had indeed lived on that land and now were living in exile. For me to be the conduit, the one who could move from these places that now were becoming subsumed beneath the land, beneath forests, erased entirely or re-inhabited, and then to move across the border to find the people who had once lived there 65 years prior and who could no longer return to that space. For me, it wasn't so much about the idea of political determinism. It was more about honoring the nature of what that pain must have meant. I mean, it was such an obvious fact of history, and it seems to me that in order to move forward beyond and to begin to repair, one has to also recognize the profundity of what has happened in the past. And this was something that occupied me throughout, and I felt in a very present sense in Israel. One of the artists yesterday said, well, Israel is, you could be anywhere and feel the same as you do in Israel. I personally have traveled much of the world, and I have never felt the degree of sort of pain, complexity, and been as confounded as I was there. But I did indeed find something that was about, at least, even though I don't know how that can be followed on from this acknowledgement, was at least about honoring this wound or honoring this loss, memorialization. It's here within the images of the land where you see perhaps traces not only of a recent past, perhaps of a demolition of last month, but you see images that are from the Nabatean era or prehistory that one can't see from the land when one stands upon it, but when one flies above it, you see all of these clues and traces that if you look then with greater closeness, you start to unravel a deep and very complex and interwoven history. And for me, that can be, interestingly for me, because I had never photographed from the air and I rarely photograph the landscape, but I felt very much as though these images, for me at least, of the landscape or of seeing it from this plane flying above the land, were similar to what I knew of seeing the refugees. There's sort of the landscape of the face within a portrait offers you something, but there's always something that the person retains within them that can't be accessed by the photographer, a kind of depth of emotion and history. And the picture, in a way, is a kind of, for me at least, it's an invitation to the viewer to want to try and then unravel what is held beyond the facade.
Beautiful. It's now up to you all out there, to help us with some of the questions that we're struggling with. I think our opportunity is to ask questions, if you have them, and we hope you do, of these artists, and I know they will give you their heartfelt answers. So, first row, excellent. This is a good beginning.
I was curious, the nature of your work as photographers is inherently solo. I was saying the nature of your work is inherently solo, except for Wendy, but this was a project that you all intersected, that the 12 photographers had some interaction with each other. I recognize in many times you were separate, but that there were some connections. And was there any cross-fertilization or ways in which you were perhaps influenced by engagement and interaction with each other? Did that happen at all?
I wouldn't say cross-fertilization so much as real support from the other photographers, support to go through the struggle of working there, and you know, having this time in between when we were there, actually, to connect and talk, that was, and also that we all saw it in different ways and had different kinds of struggles, so that was important to me.
I would agree with Wendy. There was an unspoken and unspeakable deep companionship of pain.
I have just a question to ask. Is that true generally among photographers, or is it this group? Okay, we'll move on.
Excuse me, Jeff, you have to address your questions to somebody, otherwise you will not get an answer.
We normally don't get to do it, so it's hard to compare.
Well, for me, I mean, you can imagine some of us are more particularly controlling than others in general, and we all primarily work. I for one, work almost always alone without even an assistant, and so this was one of the first experiences for me of working in a small, confined, complicated place with many people, including some wonderful assistants. And what really surprises me until now is the incredible generosity of my fellow photographers. I mean, you could imagine that 12 people would be asked to do a project that would, you know, be such a public piece and would travel and would perhaps be more competitive with one another. But I never, in all the times I traveled there, felt that in the least. I only felt the kind of pure warmth amongst us. And curiously, for me, you know, we all came up with things that are very different one from the next. I think that was given probably the freedom, the time, and the, you know, the great support of all these assistants we had.
Yes, sir.
Pavel Baňka. I am not sure if I haven't missed the answer before, but I was wondering how all of you knew each other before, if you met just partially or completely, and how, if you can say about others, only maybe by one sentence, how would you define the other colleagues? Maybe only 4 of you, if you can.
Well, I'll just answer on behalf of all, just the first part. I think some of the artists had met each other. You heard that Gilles and Joseph are part of this cooperative community of photographers, Magnum, and others knew each other professionally, and others didn't know each other at all. I think that's safe to say. In terms of the second part of your question, in terms of the community, I think that they were meeting each other, even if they knew each other, in a place that they had never traveled to together. So that created a common ground, a little bit. But I don't think we can characterize any of us easily. I mean, I wouldn't want to.
It's not about characterizing each other. I mean, Joseph and I are friends. We love each other. We argue all the time. I'm friends with Stephen Shaw. We work together. We're very different. We enjoy tremendously, reviewing students' work together and so on. So it's about a dialectical process. It's sincere people who are together trying to make sense of things. But it's not about judgment or definition.
I have one question. Jeff, at the beginning you said it's as well a kind of to avoid names or naming. And we have displays. I would like to ask the artists if the project couldn't gain if you name. Like you talk about Israel, you talk about Palestinian territories, about West Bank. whatever. And I think Wendy's project shows very well in this short description how you can get access if you name and if you give some content. So I would like to understand if it's where this fear to name and to put it comes from, because I think why avoid it and couldn't it gain?
Do you have any suggestions? No, I'm interested in your suggestion. Let's take a poll.
I do think it's really interesting, because if you look at the names of people's individual books, you know, they all avoid that, and they're the most vague titles I've ever seen, including my own.
I like in your, Wendy has a graph of color that moves from one orientation to another. And if you see it, it's a very interesting visual and political and I think very effective way of explaining something that is in the work. I direct you back downstairs to see how Wendy solved that problem. It's subtle. Yes?
We've all talked about the challenges, pain, struggle, conflicts both within you and outside of you. You've all talked about the conflicts, the pain, the struggle, the interior struggle, the exterior struggle, and I was just curious, were there moments and experiences of unexpected joy, of soul enrichment?
It's a good question.
In my case, most of the time, I do the things which it please me to photograph. In that case, it was fascinating to photograph it, but I suffer all the time. I could never stay longer than 3 weeks, because every day we started, I'm talking about my friend Gilad, who took me around, and thanks to him I understood much more. He's an Israeli photographer, born in Israel, and he said, when he traveled with me, he really discovered Israel. For me, if you start every day, 8 o'clock, and you don't see and you don't meet anybody else by only the people who are around the world, who are suffering, you are becoming crazy. I have been taking the notes, and I find even a note that if I would stay longer, maybe I would commit suicide, which probably I wouldn't. But the note is there. I couldn't stay there longer. Every time when I was leaving, I remember saying to Frederick, when I be sitting in the plane, leaving Israel, I be the most happy person in the world. And it is true. Every time I was real happy. I got back. I felt that it is important to photograph what I saw. I don't think that it has much importance. What I'm showing in this book is just what I saw. And this project was one of the most difficult things which I did in my life. I think the Russians, photographing the Russians was so easy. First of all, why? It was exceptional situation. It was tragic, but I saw the people who were fighting for freedom. Here, I saw all the time, unfortunately on the both sides, I saw the people who were not happy. even that I was getting every day an Israel newspaper and Herald Tribune. And I don't read newspaper. I never get television in my life. I don't have computer. I don't follow the news. But every day I read everything. I was cutting these pieces. I have 4 books like that with all these cuttings. I stopped after 5 trips to Israel because I realized there is no point to do it. I know that I know everything. There's the repetition. And when I saying that I saw the sad people on the both sides, I saw my Israeli friends, and I realized that not all of them, of course. You know, there are 80% of Israel who are very happy to live in Israel. Yeah. But even probably this 80%, they are thinking, a lot of them, you know, Israelis are very bright people. I think Israel is the concentration of the highest intelligent, most bright people in the world. And I think they realize that they become what they didn't want to be. Palestinian too.
I think I have sort of the opposite, had the opposite experience, because instead of having the wall, I had all these communities that really opened themselves up to me. And I think in a lot of ways, Israel was the easiest place I've ever worked. Hardly anybody said no. I mean, I think maybe only one group that we talked to said no. And everybody wanted to say something. And besides having someone like Ronit to go through the experience with, I could sort of, you know, it wasn't just me reacting. I could see how she, as an Israeli Jew, reacted to where we were going to. So I felt it was a lot of ways a joyous experience with a lot of sadness, obviously.
May I answer to Joseph? So, life is beautiful. I love Joseph passionately, and we disagree about everything. And also I've seen Joseph change. When Joseph came out of Czechoslovakia after the Russian invasion and so on, Joseph was so careful about avoiding anything political. And as Joseph has progressed in age and as the Russian tanks are further and further away, Joseph is more and more and more political. He will not act. Shut up, Joseph.
I'm not political at all.
Yes, you are. You're becoming more and more political.
Now, I think you are mixing two things.
Wait 1 second. I want to finish my sentence.
Wait a moment. When, you know, when I was born, I was brought up with my family. And my father, he was not political. He never went to any party, but he told me, he beat me up when I was 17 years old because I tell him a little lie. And he did very well that he beat me up. He taught me that I should say what I think, which I think was the most important, what he could do to me. Yeah. It make my life difficult, but in the same time, it made my life easier, much easier. You eliminate certain type of people immediately. Anyway, but my father, in that time, they came communists to the power. And he was not political man. He said, this man, they don't like to work. They are saying the lies, and they try just to order the other people what they should do and how they should think. What I learned from my father was the most important thing which I could learn for my life.
I'm going to finish my sentence, Joseph.
So, just finish. So,
fuck it!
It was not about political, it was about moral. I think moral is much more important than politic. You know, I judge people. They can be gypsies, they can be Israeli, they can be Palestinian, the same way. If the strong gypsy guys attack the woman and they want to steal, it's not important for me that the gypsies. If somebody steals, he steals. And people shouldn't steal.
May I, Joseph? May I finish my sentence? So I'm very much like Wendy. I have a complete, a reverse experience of you, which is I'm in no rush to get out of Jerusalem. And actually, if I could bring my family and spend more time, I would be extremely happy. Not because it's a comfortable place, but because I embrace it. So, one, for better or worse, it's very much the center of the world, which is that when you look at the historical machine, the machine at work, that's churning for the last 30, 40 years, this is the center of it. And the people who are caught in the middle of this historical machine, Israelis and Palestinians and so on, people who suffer, yes. But, they are profoundly human, and it's a profound element of the human condition in history. We're all historical animals. So I embrace it, and I'm comfortable in it. You may speak, Joseph.
I said everything what I thought I should say.
Yes. We have a last question from the audience.
I just wanted to know if you are planning to go back to Israel. All of you. I was wondering if you are going back to Israel on some other project.
I, for one, yes, I'm in the midst of another project, which is a series of testimonies, 10 Palestinians and 10 Israeli Jews, using their own archives and their voice to be interwoven in sort of short story form. I hope to sort of allude to the layers of complexity within the society. And for me, that was also this idea that was a kind of grace that was given to us, was this ability, as I said before, to move with fluidity from one community into another. I for instance, was the recipient of great hospitality, and ironically, both in refugee communities and within Israeli communities. And so for me, it's very interesting to remain open to both of those sides, to listen sort of carefully to what's given us and to try and bring that forward. And just back to Julie's earlier question, I mean, you talk about joy, and I know it sounds as though, we were all enduring this horrible time, but I think probably for all of us, the greatest joy we have is when we find the thing that captivates us to work on. And so the working process may be somewhat arduous, and for me, I can attest that being in Israel and moving across was every day a great deal of complexity. But yet the fact of finding something that moves you in a place that is perhaps the hardest place that I've ever worked has a degree of joy in it, or obsession. Because as you can see, we're all fairly obsessive characters. So.
Last 20 years, I photographed the Mediterranean. I visited 20 countries, all countries around the Mediterranean, many times twice. I was in Algeria, I was in Syria, I was in Lebanon, I was in Libya. Luckily that I have got chance to go to these countries before the conflict which are happening there now. as I told you, I am interested in how contemporary man influenced the land. It might look to you that my project doesn't fit exactly there. What I'm doing, I have been photographing already more than 200 archaeological places, Greeks and Romans mainly. Why somebody who was born in the country where there is no sea suddenly photograph these countries around the sea? I don't know exactly, but there are many different reasons. Yeah. I think I belong to this space in Europe, and I think as far as we are away from Mediterranean, we are still the product of Mediterranean. And how I'm going to, just to make it shorter, I made one small exhibition last year in Marseille. Marseille was the capital of culture capital of Europe. I made an exhibition from my work, and I have the proposition, and already it was agreed that in 2017 I make in Paris, in Pantheon, big exhibition from all my work, where it's going to be about 100 photographs, about 63 meters by 1, and the other ones are a little smaller. It is a big challenge, probably because you know what Pantheon in Paris, what it represents. Now I'm trying to find a way how this project to present it well, that in this very difficult space, that it will work. So it should happen 2017. They wanted to have it sooner, but I think I love the project so much that, in fact, I would prefer not to finish it.
Just briefly, I'm obviously going to go back when it opens in Tel Aviv, and I'm very interested, to see the people I've worked with and have them connect to this exhibition, and then we'll see what happens from there.
Okay, thank you all. I know you want to have an opportunity to collect the catalog and maybe get some signatures. I think the time is now. Thank you very much for your attention and commitment to what these artists have done. And we'll see you a little later for the next two programs. Thank you.